It's 2016. Tomb raiders in Peru's Nazca desert uncover something impossible. Mummies with three-fingered hands, retractable necks, and DNA less human than a turnip. Now, it's sparked an international scientific war that's still raging to this day. Are they proof of extraterrestrials, an ancient unknown species, or the greatest hoax ever perpetrated? Welcome to the In-Between. I'm Carol Ann, and we are about to find out. All right, I'm going to start off by telling you that this story starts like this, morphs into this, and eventually degenerates into this. We are traveling today all the way to Peru. Peru is no stranger to mummies. They're all over the place. Some of you may be familiar with the 1927 discovery of 429 mummies on the Paracas Peninsula of Peru. Now, a quick search of paracas in Wikipedia will take you to a page that talks all about the paracas culture and their frequent use of skull modification. In short, just like the Japanese like to practice foot binding, the Peruvians like to wrap the heads of their babies to make them cone heads.
Greetings.
No big deal. Doesn't really change anything like IQ or cranial capacity. It's just a different shape. And those cone head skulls are not really even all that uncommon. They've been found in Hungary, ancient Germanic regions, ancient Iranian regions, and even Sweden. What Wikipedia doesn't seem to want to talk about are what have become known as the paracas skulls. At first glance, they look like any other modified mummy skull, but this particular group of skulls is different. Not only do some of them have red hair, they have extra chiseled cheekbones and no sagittal suture on the top of their head, but they also have a cranial capacity way bigger than humans, like 30% bigger. So all of that is to set the stage for the drama that began to unfold around the end of 2016, around 120 miles to the southeast of the Paracas Peninsula in the Nazca region of Peru. Yup, that Nazca. Same area where you can find those famous Nazca lines, the super huge drawings in the sand that you can only really see from the air. Now, just for reference, just over 300 miles to the northeast of Nazca is Machu Picchu. So this whole little area here is rife with ancient history and priceless artifacts. As you might imagine, Nazca is not the wealthiest area of Peru. They do okay for themselves, but it's not an economic powerhouse by any stretch. So what do you get when you add a mediocre at best economy and a priceless artifact-rich environment? Huaqueros, or tomb raiders. I seriously doubt they look like that. Relics of ancient civilizations and even entire mummies are big black market business in Peru. So it's not exactly the rarest thing in the world for people to make a side hustle out of finding and selling anything that they can find out in the arid desert. The first character in our little drama is Paul R. Paul approaches a French guy named Thierry Yamin, who is a well-known archaeologist in Peru and president of the Inkari Institute. He contacts Thierry and says, "Hey, asking for a friend. Are you interested in looking at these super funky alien-looking mummies we found?" After chatting for a while, we find out that the friend is Mario, not his real name. His real name would later be discovered to be Leandro Benedicto Rivera. Let's just stick with Mario. More negotiations ensue, and Paul and Mario finally agree to bring some of their samples to Thierry. Remember that these guys are basically confessing to a crime here, so they are covering their butts big time. Antiquity theft in Peru is a big no-no. Mario tells Thierry that he and his crew found a whole bunch of these things in some caves in the mountains somewhere between Nazca and Palpa. Thierry takes the samples around for some preliminary testing, and being satisfied that, at least on a surface level, they seem to be legit, he fires off a letter in early 2017 to the Peruvian Ministry of Culture asking if they've heard about this. Without waiting for a response, because when does the government do anything quickly, Thierry heads down to the Nazca area of Peru to see the rest of the collection. He and his team bring back a couple of small, mummified heads and a larger hand for X-ray analysis in February of 2017. Based on those results, they start crowdfunding to raise money for DNA and carbon-14 testing to be done. It only takes a month before they hit over 125% of their goal. At the beginning of April 2017, several samples are taken from 2 of these tiny mummified bodies and sent to various labs around the world for testing. This is when Jaime Maussan enters the picture. Maussan has had a long, award-winning career in journalism in Mexico. He is the face of the Mexican version of 60 Minutes, and he's had a show for like 20 years on UFO investigations. However, he kind of muddies the waters in this case because of his past involvement in a couple of other cases. In 2015, he led an event called Be Witness, where event organizers unveil a mummified body, claiming it to be an alien child. The mummified corpse was later identified as a human child. Then in 2016, he cries alien again with something called the Metapec creature, which later turns out to be a skinned monkey, and a demon fairy, which turns out to be the remains of a bat, wooden sticks, epoxy, and other unknown elements. Now, I have no idea whether this guy is a total fraud looking for a quick buck, which doesn't seem likely given his long accomplished career in journalism, or if he just wants to believe so bad that his skeptic muscle hasn't been exercised in a long time. But whatever the case, he jumps into the Nazca Mummies fray. And in May of 2017, Peruvian journalist Joyce Mantilla, accompanied by a team of scientists sponsored by Gaia TV, arrive in Cusco, Peru, where the mummies are being held to start their own investigation. It's important to note that unlike Jaime, who has a long history in the ufology world, Joyce does not. This is not his usual beat, so he is starting with a clean slate. More researchers are getting involved and more tests are being performed. And on November 19th, 2018, test results are presented to the Peruvian government in a hearing by independent groups representing a whole slew of different disciplines from Peru, Mexico, the US, and Canada, including some pretty heavy hitters in their respective fields. Their respective conclusions, in a nutshell, are that whatever these things are, they're not fake. They don't say they're aliens, just that from what they've seen so far, they deserve more in-depth study. Remember now, this is not the most popular project to be working on. These guys are putting their reputation of their entire careers on the line. Now, apparently, before the hearing, the Ministry of Culture, who I'm going to refer to as the MOC from now on, was on board to be there, but for whatever reason, they back out at the last minute. Official reaction to the findings of the hearing? Crickets. Jump ahead to August 1st, 2019. Everyone who's been working on this case to date manages to get 4 mummies to the University of Ica in Peru, where they are put through a large battery of testing from more Peruvian scientists. Jump ahead again to September of 2023. Jaime Maussan presents bodies to the Mexican Congress and says, "We are not alone." He is joined by Jose de Jesus Zalce Benitez, director of the Scientific Institute for Health of the Mexican Navy, who says X-rays, 3D reconstruction, and DNA analysis has been carried out on the remains. They don't have any real answers yet, but they are working on it. 1 month later, in October of 2023, a news story hits almost all of the mainstream media outlets, showing dressed up versions of smaller mummies that had been confiscated by the MOC from the Lima airport and taken away for testing. 3 months later, so January of 2024, the ministry holds a press conference to show off the dolls and proclaim them as fakes. What they don't tell you is that they have a statement from the creator of the dolls that, yeah, he made them. He lives in the Nazca area and made the dolls as souvenirs, hoping to earn a little extra coin. But the MOC has chosen to keep that the quiet part and trot these dress-wearing versions out for the press to say, see, these are fake, so by association, they're all fake. And right there with them is their henchman, Flavio Estrada, an archaeologist with Peru's Institute for Legal Medicine and Forensic Sciences. Joyce Mantilla, the Peruvian journalist, actually stands up and challenges the MOC, essentially saying that the ones you have right there are fakes, but they are not the same as the ones we have at the university. But how would you know, because you've never bothered to come by and take a look? Other than these two fakes, Estrada has never studied any of the mummies at the University of Ica or anywhere else. So how can he say they're fake? Flavio Estrada's response? You're a liar and a shill for Jaime Maussan. If you can't kill the message, kill the messenger. Then in April of 2024, an American team flies to Peru to take their crack at solving the mystery. The team consists of Dr. John McDowell, a forensic odontologist who worked on identifying some of the remains from 9/11 and retired professor at the University of Colorado, Dr. William Rodriguez, a forensic anthropologist with the Maryland State Medical Examiner, and Dr. James Caruso, a U.S. Navy veteran who is now the city of Denver's chief medical examiner, and John McDowell's son, Josh, a defense attorney out of Colorado Springs. Whatever equipment the university doesn't have on hand, they bring in via the Peruvian equivalent of U-Haul so that the scientists don't have to take the mummies from university property. They're afraid the MOC is going to try to take the mummies because they've done it before. But we'll get to the MOC shenanigans in just a moment. At the conclusion of their testing, a big press conference is held on April 4th, 2024, to discuss some of the findings, issues, etc., streaming live worldwide when the Ministry of Culture decides to crash the press conference. They think one of the mummies is in the room and they want it, but they are sorely disappointed to find out they're skunked. One of their officers takes the mic and says they are filing suit to get possession of the mummies. The reason the scientists don't take the mummies off the university property and didn't bring any of them to the press conference is because this is not the first time the MOC has tried to take the mummies. The Ministry of Culture has tried 7 times over the years to raid the university to confiscate the mummies. But, and I love this part, because they never answered the original notification letter from Thierry Yamin back in 2017 and never came out to investigate, the mummies cannot be verified as coming from a designated archaeological project, which means they are not subject to the Ministry of Culture's jurisdiction. They have no right to take them. The university tells them to go pound sand. November 7th, 2024, so just this past November, the rector of the University of Ica, Jorge Moreno Leua, sends a letter to the Mexican Congress signed by 11 professors certifying the authenticity of the bodies they studied. The letter basically states that they have all come to the conclusion that whatever these things are, they are genuine specimens of a biological origin that were alive at some point. And they're not fabricated in any way. That very night, the rector gets fired. Also this past November, the American team goes back down to Peru to participate in a congressional hearing on how to proceed in moving forward with studying these mummies. I guess only time will tell whether or not Peru decides to go all in or not. So what is all the drama about? What makes grown men resort to adult versions of, I know you are, but what am I? Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the Nazca Mummies. Maria, Montserrat, Wawida, Victoria, Alberto. And there are many more. According to Mario, over 100. There are apparently 7 different species, some more human-like and taller, around a normal human height, and some more reptilian that stand like about 2 feet tall. All are covered in this white powdery substance, which has been determined to be diatomaceous earth, which is a naturally occurring soft sedimentary rock that is composed of the fossilized remains of diatoms, tiny aquatic microorganisms. You've probably even used it without even knowing it. It's used a lot for things like water filtration, different abrasives like toothpaste, and even as an insecticide. And it's all over the place in the Nazca Desert region. But to my knowledge, these are the only mummies discovered to ever be covered in that powder. But the powder is probably the reason we still have the mummies in the generally good condition they're in today. Diatomaceous earth, or DE, is a desiccant. It absorbs moisture. Not that moisture is a huge problem in the Nazca Desert. It averages about 2 millimeters of rain per year, one of the driest places on Earth. But still, any moisture that they do get that could foster the growth of mold is quashed by the DE. And remember, it's an insecticide, so any insect activity that would have happened didn't. So because of that amazing preservation, we now have several humanoid beings that have gone through various levels of testing in different labs around the world. One thing to note though, not all testing is the same. Not every country has the latest and greatest, which is why the US team is trying to convince Peru to let some of them come to the US for testing. We can't cover all of them, so I'm going to talk about Maria, one of the full-size mummies, Yoshina, one of the 2-foot versions, Wawida, an infant that looks to be the same species as Maria, and Montserrat, another female a little smaller than Maria. And just for reference, the DNA testing, which we will get into more later, has pegged these mummies as being about 1,800 years old. The most well-known, and the one with, I think, the most testing is Maria. She's about 5.5 feet tall. Her bone structure is almost identical to ours with a few exceptions. She has no real visible nose or ears, which is pretty common for mummies, but the inner structure of the ear is different than in humans. And her hands have 3 fingers with 4 phalanges. Phalanges are just the finger sections. Humans have only 3. By the looks of the scans, the joints between the bones are still intact. Her cranial cavity is 19% larger than a normal human's. While the practice of head wrapping was common in ancient Peru, that only changes the shape, not the capacity. Also, the thickness of the skull is much thicker than a human's. And her feet are interesting. Aside from the fact that she has only 3 toes on each foot, they have the same basic bones, but the actual structure is different. The way her foot is built, it would never step flat onto the ground. She would only be using her heel and toes and would have to lean forward while she walked to keep her balance. And poor Maria had a really bad back, maybe from having to lean forward all the time. She has 1 crushed vertebrae and arthritis all over. Wawida, which means baby in Quechua, the official language of Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador, appears to be an infant of the same species as Maria. There isn't really a whole lot to say about Wawida that hasn't already been said about Maria, but we are going to hear more about Wawida a little later. So let's talk about Yoshina. She is a specimen of the 2-foot variety, and these guys are different. Not only do the faces look different with raised brow ridge, their bodies are way different. Yoshina's skeleton has something that no other vertebrate species on Earth has. Her spine is in the middle of her body, not against her back, which is the position of every spine in any other animal on the planet. And according to the scientists who examined her, they say that the space behind her spine at the top is part of her digestive system. Now, the lower part of the spine doesn't have any room behind it, and it kind of curves just a bit. Why? Well, that's the reason we call her Yoshina and not Yosef. That curve is the same thing that our spines do when we're carrying a baby as a way to make room as the baby grows. And you guessed it, Yoshina is carrying eggs, which is part of the reason these smaller versions are considered more reptilian than human. But also because the way her neck is built, there's a possibility that it was retractable, like a turtle. Also, her joints are built different. They're not the round ball and socket joints that we have. They're more like a flat plane where the bone attaches. This would make it so all of her joints could only move forward and backward. She didn't have the radial range of motion that we do. Also, look at her head position. If the shape of her head is due to head wrapping, then the place where the spine connects to the head would remain in the same spot. But on Yoshina, it's not. It's further back on the skull than usual. Like Maria, Yoshina's hands have 3 fingers. However, unlike Maria, Yoshina only has 3 phalanges on her hand and 3 on her feet, so just like us. And she has a bad back too. She has spots on her spine that look like what could have been a paralyzing injury. But interestingly enough, directly across from the area on her front side is this metal plate that seems to be fused to her skin, like maybe it's some kind of correction for her injury. The plate is made mostly of copper, and it's pretty typical for her time period. Her ribs are not like any species that has ribs. Usually ribs originate in the back from the spine, wrap around to the front, and attach to a sternum. Hers go all the way around like a ring. And oddly enough, she has hollow bones like a bird. That's not human or reptile. So who knows where that comes from? Lastly, let's take a look at Montserrat. She's just a little smaller than Maria and has many of the same characteristics. But what makes her special is that, unlike Yoshina and her eggs, Montserrat is carrying a fetus, Raphael. It's a little hard to see him or her, but initial scans show what look to be 3 fingers and toes, just like Mom. So there you have it. Now, we have to try and decide if they are real beings or are they hoaxes. The argument that they're real is, well, they're real, but the argument for them being fakes would go something like this. The Huaquero Tomb Raiders. I just love saying that word. Huaqueros. Found some mummies, ripped off a couple of fingers and toes, added some extra bones to make the fingers and toes look not human, and covered their alterations with a plaster of diatomaceous earth to hide the evidence of tampering. Okay. Let's go piece by piece through the arguments. And as usual, there are far more rabbit holes to go down on this one than I have time to cover, so we're going to hit the ones that hit me. Starting on the outside, let's first talk about the DE, the diatomaceous earth. Seems to have undergone some process to make it more of a powder, which would make it not natural unless the ancient Peruvians ground it up themselves, which I guess is possible. But to make DE into a plaster that would harden to any degree, to make it into a kind of plaster that any hoaxer would need to keep the evidence of tampering with the body a secret, it needs to be mixed with a binder like lime, clay, or cement. But in numerous pictures, you can see the powder flaking off pretty readily. If the hoaxers are trying to cover up their misdeeds, they probably should have picked something better than DE. Fluoroscopy scans, which is like a 3D real-time X-ray, were conducted and showed no difference in bone density. which would most likely show up if the bones were borrowed from a different body or a different animal. But there are other more precise tests that can and should be done to know for sure. The Russian team found traces of a chemical called cadmium chloride on the surface of the bodies, which they say only became available in the mid-19th century as a preservative. They talk about how Peruvians from 1800 years ago could not have had this chemical, implying it has to be an advanced race. However, they never talk about whether or not it's possible that it could be something done just recently. Now, I can't really see a single thing that cadmium chloride is used for today in Peru that even comes close to archaeology in any way. So I can't even begin to speculate on how it would get there. But it's still certainly a possibility. John Perry from the YouTube channel Stated Casually makes some very interesting observations. Not only does Maria's face look an awful lot like any other mummy from the Peruvian desert, which often lose their soft tissues like their nose and their ears, but it would not be that hard to remove the thumb and the pinky of each hand and sever the tissue between the remaining 3 fingers. You would get basically what Maria's hands look like. However, Maria has extra phalanges. But if you're an industrious forger trying to create something unique, maybe you add some extras on there from other mummies, like a macabre game of cooties. Scans of her fingers seem to show that the joint sleeves between the finger bones are still intact, something that the examiners say would be next to impossible to reconstruct. And x-rays of Maria's feet show a bone structure very similar to a human's, except that the calcaneus bone, or what we would call the heel. Maria's heel does not project backwards like a normal human's does. Orthopedists say this would mean she would not have been able to plant her foot flat on the ground and would have been walking mainly on her toes and heel, leaning slightly forward to keep her center of gravity. Now, if you have been following this subject at all, you may have heard a bit of a dust-up over the llama head theory. In short, many people think that the mummy heads are the brain casing section of a llama skull. In fact, a video called Show Me the Mummies from the Incredible History YouTube channel even shows footage of a llama skull that indeed looks a lot like the mummy faces. That just about sold me on it being a fake right there and then. But just to be thorough, I went to a 3D modeling website and looked up llama skull, and none of the 3 different models they had uploaded look anything like what I saw on that YouTube clip. I even tried alpaca skull just for fun, since they seem to be just smaller versions of the same thing. But that doesn't look right either. But I will admit that the llama skull theory has some merit. If you want to jump down that rabbit hole, there is a link to a research paper that talks about it in the list of sources in the description. This paper from 2021 looks specifically at Josefina's head, and they do a pretty good job of going through every part of the skull and seemingly being honest about where the llama head theory holds and where it doesn't. They even go so far as to comment in the conclusion section concerning the remains of the head of Josefina. They are biological in nature. At the available resolution of the CT scanning, no manipulation of Josefina's skull can be detected. But they still conclude in general that Josefina's head is the brain case of a llama. Just a little side dish of interesting. One of the authors of the paper, Jose de la Cruz Rios Lopez, a Mexican biologist, was one of the scientists to testify in front of the Peruvian government at their hearing in 2018 in favor of the mummies being real, unknown entities worthy of further study. Then 3 years later, comes out with this paper that says Josefina's head is a llama skull, and has since retracted that stance and has jumped back into the real entity camp. Wow! While we're on the subject of Josephine, let's talk about those eggs. In the X-ray, They're pretty hard to miss, bright white egg-shaped circles. But let's take a look at another reptile X-ray. Here's the X-ray of a turtle who is carrying eggs. Notice the difference between the two X-rays. Eggs are not solid in an X-ray. So I don't know what Josephine is carrying, but they don't look like eggs. Now that we're talking about babies, let's get back to Wawita. Here is where the major cracks start for me. The hoaxer theory's claim is that the three-fingered hands are made by taking a real mummy, taking off the thumb and the pinky, and slicing between the fingers down to the wrist. When I started to look at the scans of Wawita, I can't help but notice the areas of both her hands and her feet that look like something has been torn away. Not to mention the picture that actually shows a row of 4 phalanges on her right hand when logically there should only be 3. Looking at these scans, it's pretty hard not to see where the thumbs and pinky fingers used to be. So let's look at some of the other issues while we're at it. Josephine seems to have some random bone just stuck right into her elbow. Maybe all those scientists are missing a few things. They spend a lot of time looking through each section and talking about how, like having eggs and surrounding abdominal tissue would be hard to fake. Same with the head. And I totally get that I may have missed a lecture or two, but telling me that it would be hard to fake an abdomen isn't helpful, because a forger's not going to reconstruct the thing from scratch. They're going to splice together things they already have on hand. But okay, let's get to the juicy part, the DNA. Samples were actually sent to a few different places. By the way, the-alien-project.com is like the official site for the real camp that has all the scans and x-rays and test results that you can go look at. So the website shows that Maria only shared about 30% of her DNA with humans. To put that into perspective, humans share 50% of our DNA with turnips. So 30% is pretty dang low. That number comes from the testing done at the lab in Mexico. However, the report generated about the samples that were sent to Canada states that the DNA is highly contaminated. In fact, according to them, every sample they tested contained both female and male DNA. Here's the best part. The lab can pretty confidently say that the samples taken from Maria, from one of her vertebrae and from one of her left toes, that those two come from the same person. However, they cannot say with any certainty that the sample from the palm of her right hand belongs to the same person. Not to mention, there was an initial group of researchers from Great Britain who were invited by the Inkari Institute to come and look at the mummies very early on in the process. They took their own DNA samples and had them analyzed. Steve Mera, who headed up that group, says the results that they got back were confusing at first. They didn't make any sense. That is, until they figured out that the sample they had taken from one of Maria's phalanges had different DNA than that from the very next phalange. Both human, but 2 different humans. So needless to say, this whole thing is feeling more than a little sketch. Then start adding in more information, like the fact that nobody knows where these mummies came from. Mario has taken a select few people to the cave, but those people say there's no way that's where the mummies were, that the place is nowhere near big enough for all of them. But that's not stopping Mario from continuing to charge people thousands of dollars to take tour groups to that same location. We know the Huaqueros are still selling mummies on the black market to this day. That's big business in their part of the world. We're talking 7 figures for one of these things. And at least 2 groups of researchers had to pay Mario money just to see Maria. They obviously only care about cashing in. And given that it seems to be working, what's more likely? That these tomb raiders found some mummies and want to lend them to science to be studied for humanity? Or that they have a taxidermy shop set up somewhere creating alien mummies as fast as they can? And it's not just the huaqueros. Remember Jaime Maussan, our over-exuberant journalist who just wants to believe so much that he's easily been duped twice before? Well, he posted on X a quote from Dr. John McDowell from the American team who went down to Peru last April. The post starts with the quote from Dr. McDowell, but then goes on to add the names of some of the mummies, including Victoria, who's one of the smaller 2-foot versions. So Jaime just lumped them all together, inferring that the quote from Dr. McDowell covers that whole list as being real. The problem is that the American team never looked at the smaller mummies. When the good doctor is asked about the inference made by Jaime and about the smaller mummies, he responds with, "It would be foolish to state that these bodies could represent individuals that could have been alive, let alone capable of walking, flying, or swimming. Please do not infer that we said otherwise." Huh. So Jaime doesn't look quite so innocent this time. Between him and the huaqueros, I think there's plenty of shade to go around. Once you add in the laughable DNA results, the fact that Juanita and Josephine are almost certainly fakes, and if they're fakes, you have to assume that the others are fakes. All of that together leads me to believe they're fakes. I wanted so much to believe they are real, but this time, I just can't. But here's what I don't understand. Why would all of the other researchers risk their careers by signing off on this? Obviously, none of them are saying these are alien beings, just that there's enough smoke that it's worth looking for a fire. I gotta admit, the sheer number of academics involved in this project willing to testify before government committees to try to move the ball of scientific study further down the court makes me wonder if there really is something there. Maybe being human isn't quite what we all think it is. I know. I can't believe that I have to admit that I think they're fakes. But I gotta be real, right? If you think I'm wrong, that I've misread the room somehow, feel free to let me know in the comments. And if I hear of any game-changing news in the future, I'll be sure to let you know in one of our members-only updates. But for now, if you want to continue your Quincy quest, click right here. Come on, it'll be fun. Be careful out there. And I will see you here again on the InBetween. Vaquero.